to domineer and rule over his wife in an ungodly way. We see that the ground is cursed. It no longer yields the fruit without thorns and thistles. And man is cursed in that he is destined to return to the dust from which he came. Have you ever thought about what it would have been like if they had just moved one tree over and eaten of the tree of life? What a different world we would live in. But they did not, because they did not believe what God had said. Therefore they disobeyed and they ate of the fruit. The consequence of this is that man is driven from the garden. Now remember, the garden is the temple paradise. They are in perfect relationship with God, perfect unity with God, walking with Him and talking with Him as easily as they walked and talked with each other, because there was nothing to come between them and God, no sin to interrupt that union. But then they are driven from the presence of God because of what? The sin that separated that union. They are driven from the presence of God, and in this, man's soul anchor is severed. And we are plunged into restlessness. The perfect rest that Adam and Eve possessed in the garden was lost in that moment of unbelief and disobedience. As a result, the whole of human history is a sad tale of the restlessness and the emptiness that grips the heart of man. I'm fascinated with the book of Ecclesiastes, and I find myself reading it more and more. As you know, the writer of Ecclesiastes was the great King Solomon, the great wise King Solomon, who was blessed above measure by God. But when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, you realize that Solomon was a man who tried to satisfy the restlessness of his heart with many different things before he came to the conclusion that he came to. As you read the book of Ecclesiastes, listen to these passages. Solomon says, "And I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly." And I perceive this is also the striving for the wind. He applied himself to the gaining of wisdom. He applied himself to understanding what makes men lose their minds and become mad. And he says, there's no satisfaction in wisdom. And what does Scripture say that God blessed Solomon with? Wisdom above any man who had ever ruled on the throne of Israel ever. He had great wisdom, but there was not satisfaction in that wisdom. Look at what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1. I said in my heart, okay, wisdom doesn't do it. Come now, I will test your heart. I will test my heart with pleasure. He says, I said to my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But what is his conclusion? All of this is vanity. Literally, the word vanity means nothingness. It's emptiness. It is void of any real meaning. So wisdom didn't do it. Pleasure didn't do it. Of course, we also know that Solomon was the richest king who ever ruled in Israel. Look at what he says about riches. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. You know, there's probably no man who's ever lived more capable of accurately making that statement than was Solomon. Money didn't satisfy the restlessness of his soul. Wisdom didn't do it. Pleasure didn't do it. Money didn't do it. And he comes down in chapter 6 and verse 7, and he says, all the toil of man is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is not satisfied. Now, you have to go back and look at the context here, but he's not talking about filling your belly. He is talking about the fact that man has an appetite for something far greater than that which the riches and the wisdom and the pleasures of this world can ever possibly fill. There's an emptiness there. There's an appetite there that cannot be satisfied with temporal things. He says it this way in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. You're very familiar with this passage. God, there's a time to live, there's a time to die, there's a time to laugh, and so on and so forth. And he comes down to the end of that section. He says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. And then this assertion also, He has put eternity into man's heart. I've been cogitating on that for several years now. That is a large statement. God created man differently than all the rest of the creatures. God created man with an appetite and a desire in his heart that nothing on this earth can possibly satisfy. He created man with eternity in his heart, and we're going to look back to that. He comes down to the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes, and he says in chapter 12, verse 13, the end of the matter. This is the end of the matter. After everything has been tested, I've sought everything to fill and satisfy the emptiness of my heart. He says this is the conclusion. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In the end, Solomon concluded that only a right relationship with God could satisfy the void and the nothingness in his soul. Augustine of Hippo states it this way. He said, Father, Thou hast made us for Thyself, and our hearts are restless until we find our rest in Thee. That is a summation, a one-sentence summation of the entire book of Ecclesiastes. God made us for Himself. God made us for relationship with Himself. And void of that relationship, or apart from that relationship, our souls are doomed to restlessness. As Augustine says, until we find our rest in Thee. So we see this morning that sin separates man from relationship and rest with God and plunges us into a sea of restlessness and dissatisfaction and hopelessness. I'm so glad that that's not the end of the story. I'm so glad that Adam and Eve's exit from the temple paradise there in the garden was not the end of the story, aren't you, Harry? Our writer in Hebrews says, there remains a rest. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There remains a rest. There's a cure for this restlessness. How do we define this rest? We saw even last week, though I did not give you, and purposely did not give you, a biblical definition of that rest, we saw certainly last week that this cannot be rest in the sense that we understand rest. First of all, we see that it is God's rest. It is a rest that belongs, and don't miss what I'm saying here, this is so vital to the whole of this message. This rest is a rest that belongs exclusively to God. I'd never realized how emphatic that is stated in Scripture until the last several weeks as I've been trying to hone this down to something that I could deliver as a message. I want you to look how many times the writer of Hebrews, just in the passage we read this morning, makes this statement. Chapter 3, verse 18a. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter?